welcome. So as you guys know, I'm Harry, our client partnerships lead here at WeShape Tech Consultancy. I'm really excited to bring you to this roundtable discussing human AI collaboration from an AI ethics point of view. As our speakers and all of you know, we'll be discussing the ethical frameworks for human AI collaboration, transparency and accountability, including ensuring fairness and avoiding bias, and lastly, the future implications and recommendations. So it'd be great to have some quick introductions from our speakers. To kick off, we have Dr. Zachary Goldberg from Trilateral.
Yeah, hi, Harry. Hi, everyone. I am the Ethics Innovation Manager at Trilateral Research. And at the company, we create ethical AI solutions for complex societal problems. And we do this in three main ways. One way is through rigorous research, another through ethical AI products, and finally through responsible AI client services. And two of the most recent ways that we've done this, we recently wrote and soon to be published a report for UK government on the principles and opportunities for responsible and trustworthy AI. And we focus not only on the principles themselves, but also on innovation gaps, market opportunities, as well as assessing the current regulatory and standards landscape in the UK. And in another way, we also recently have finished a product called Cesium. It's an application that enables safeguarding organizations to help protect vulnerable children. And this product was recently included in the CDEI AI Assurance portfolio to showcase the ethics by design processes that we use to build the tool. So very happy to be here and looking forward to the discussion.
Great, thanks, Zachary. We also have Dr. Rowena Rodrigues.
Thanks, Harry. Hi, everyone. I'm Rowena Rodrigues, and I co-lead the Innovation and Research Services team at Trilateral. And my team provides research and data science services in ethical AI and other research domains such as cybersecurity, ethics, law enforcement, crisis, health, and climate. We have experience in over 100 R&D international and national projects and tenders. So we bring a wealth of research and particularly social science expertise to the study of new technologies. And our team, which is over 60 now, includes social scientists, ethics and legal experts. We've got data scientists, we've got communication specialists, and this makes for a very good combination and a collaborative environment we work in when we do various work on new technologies in particular. With regard to AI, we've done a lot of work on the ethical and legal issues on AI, made policy recommendations, and my background is in legal and policy research and impact assessments in new and emerging technologies. Very happy to be here. Thanks, Harry.
Great, thanks, Rowena. Dr. Laura Gemmell.
Hi, I'm Laura Gemmell. I am the founder of Taught by Humans. Taught by Humans is an AI and data confidence company. What we're aiming for is to make sure that everyone, both individuals and businesses, have the skills and tools they need to use AI and data effectively. We've chosen to go with confidence instead of literacy because literacy seems to give people vibes of being back in school, whereas we're actually trying to help people just use these tools the way that works best for them. Our entire ethos is that these are tools that should help your humans, your staff, your students do what they want to do better. They shouldn't replace them. I've also just finished my PhD in how to teach the public about artificial intelligence with a big focus on co-design and how when we're thinking about ethical frameworks, we need to be thinking about them in terms of people and not just experts.
Amazing. And we have Pauline Norstrom.
Hi, everyone. I'm Pauline Norstrom. I'm the founder of Anekanta AI, which is focused on high-risk AI research, impact and risk, and that's for global commercial organizations who are using high-risk AI. And we have developed a AI risk intelligence system for biometrics and high-risk AI, and that's been published by the UK government CDEI department. And prior to this, I have over 20 years plus industrial and commercial experience bringing technology to market, mostly video-based, technology, analytics, in security, video surveillance, and I've sat on the boards of global organisations doing this. And also in my voluntary capacity, I've been a chair of a national association, the BSIA, which is a sector association for security. I now chair their biometrics and AI special interest group. And I also sit on a number of national and international ethics and standards committees for AI, including the Institute of Directors, Expert Advisory Group for Science, Innovation, Technology, and also the BSI National Body for AI, which is doing great work in terms of moving towards supporting the de facto standards that need to operationalize, shall we say, the ethical principles that we'll be discussing today.
Amazing. No, thanks for that. And Justin Townsend.
Thanks, Harry. Hello, everyone. My name's Justin Townsend. I think I guess the most important thing I'd say that I bring directly to this conversation is the practical commercial delivery of machine learning and artificial intelligence-based modeling frameworks. So modeling at scale across industry sectors, including informational media services, telecoms, and financial services or banking. And so I guess I can speak to the practical problems that come up when we look to try to implement ethical frameworks and begin to get people to follow those ethical frameworks that make sense with commercial obligations and goals as well. So thank you very much for having me and look forward to the chat.
Lovely. Cheers, Justin. And Sophie, Valentine.
Yeah, thank you so much. Hi, everyone. I'm Sophie Valentine. I'm really happy to be here and be a part of the discussion. I'm really representing also the kind of applied perspective, mostly in healthcare. So my industry career has been built really in the tech for good space. And in recent years, I've really been focusing on bringing innovation into healthcare, very much with a focus on AI, obviously huge ethical implications in that space. I'm currently heading up our product innovation initiatives at Healios, which is a health company focused on children and young people's mental health. And we're transitioning from the tech-enabled space to the tech-augmented space. I'm also chapter lead for NeurotechX, which is a global organization for advancing neurotechnologies. It's really a community role, but again, there's a lot of relevance for AI and ethics as well in that space. So really excited to be here. Thanks for having me.
Great, thanks, Sophie. And last but not least, Marcel Hedman.
Perfect, and thank you, Harry, for organizing such an amazing group. A little about me. So I'm the founder of a group called Neural Research. So we're really focused on addressing grand challenges, leveraging AI, and really trying to spread a foundational knowledge of machine learning such that practitioners can really leverage that as a building block to make informed, practical decisions in relation to that. We do that via two main areas, which is research and then kind of a bit of consultancy as well. In addition to that, I'm employee one at an early stage AI manufacturing startup, which has raised just under $10 million. And we work with the largest multi-billion-dollar revenue manufacturers to help them get ahead of their quality issues and get deeper insights into all of those emerging issues that may arise as they're building their complex vehicles. And then finally, I really do believe in the kind of intersection of industry and academia, and previously I've held in a kind of an academic sense the Choate Memorial Fellow position at Harvard University, where I was really focused on data science and marrying that with some of the scientific applications as well. But really looking forward to the discussion.
Cheers, Marcel. Well, thank you all for being part of this. I guess we're ready to get kicked off. So yes, so to kick off, when considering ethical frameworks for human AI collaboration, Zachary, could you talk about what are some key ethical frameworks that have been proposed to guide human AI collaboration? Happy to kick us off.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Harry. Well, I think, first of all, we've seen a plethora of frameworks be published in the last 5 years or so, focusing on responsible and trustworthy AI, and we can get into some of the specifics there. But I think it's worth pointing out that the guidance around how we deal with some of the ethical issues that arise with human and AI collaboration actually originated further back, and we have a whole history of philosophy, really, and philosophical ethics that focuses on the nature of values, the justification of those values, why we hold those particular characteristics or principles as values, And even though AI wasn't around 2,500 years ago, those theories that we've had for hundreds or even thousands of years have influenced directly the contemporary frameworks that we have today. So, for example, in the Western tradition, we have the big three ethical theories. We have virtue theory, Kantian ethics or deontological ethics, and consequentialism, and usually utilitarianism within that umbrella. And from those theories, we have arguments around and justifications around, certain characteristics that we value, like honesty or trustworthiness. We have a directive to focus on the consequences of our actions and whether we're producing good or bad when we do certain things. And also trade-offs for our actions, right? When one thing might be better or worse than another, what do we do? And we also have justifications and arguments around certain values that we might want to protect regardless of the good consequences that might occur if we were to transgress or violate that particular value. So, for example, human dignity, right? And so, and we can already see the influence that these ethical theories have on some of the frameworks that have been influential today. And so, this long history, it's important to look back on that, because what these theories do focus on, even if they're not focusing on AI, they are focusing on human interaction, societal values, cooperation, interaction with non-human animals and the environment. And so these are all long-standing discussions that are important to reflect upon, and that, like I said, we can see direct influence on some of the contemporary frameworks. So as we move forward, we can pick out some of the particular frameworks. I'll leave my comment there for now, but happy to come back to that after the discussion moves forward a little bit.
Yeah, great, Zachary. And Pauline, I believe you've got some thoughts on the evolution of frameworks.
Yes, looking in more sort of recent times in terms of how they've been embodied in frameworks which might be applied into the industrial setting, the commercial setting. We could probably go back to the recent times and look at the OECD framework, which contains the AI principles, which have been adopted by a number of countries around the world and are starting to settle into a given set of principles. Some include the environment, some don't, and we'd like to see that obviously in all of the frameworks that underpin the laws and the standards that are coming through. But OECD has been instrumental in creating a foundational framework, and it covers all the issues that are founded in Zach's points, fundamentally what we think is good or bad human behaviour, and consider the impacts. And as the frameworks have evolved, we've seen the European High-Level Experts Group then debate this further, and they did that in 2019 following the OECD. They added in a few additional points, and those principles have now been embodied in the amendments to the compromise text for the EU AI Act, which isn't fully enacted yet, but we've seen a very pleasing inclusion of trustworthy principles now in the law, which we hope will be ratified. And the UK government, of course, has picked up the OECD principles, spun them around a little bit, made them their own, and that's in the UK government's AI regulation white paper. And it's very pleasing to see foundational principles running through all these documents, and they're starting to emerge in standards as well. And sector standards, I worked with the BSIA to develop an ethical and legal guide to one of the most controversial forms of AI tech, which is facial recognition software. And where do we start? So we started with OECD, and those are baked in, those principles. And those principles are now going to go into a standard which has evolved out of that framework. That's very much domain driven and sector orientated, but it's the principles that sit underneath, that underlie these frameworks, which are really important. What I'd like to see is some consistency in the use of language and interpretation of the meaning of those principles. So when they are embodied in the to-do lists, the checklists and standards. They're operationalized, that they're easy for organizations with a range of skills. Business leaders not all have the advantage of the deep sort of research that goes on when PhDs are created. Are very practical and are looking at what decisions they have to make, and it's just a different way of thinking. So that's my perspective on it. It's very pleasing to see the principles evolving like this, but we need to see more by way of introducing consistency across these approaches.
So yes, there's still more to be done there. Sophie, so what's your thoughts on, in a rapidly evolving AI landscape, how can we assess the adaptability and the relevance of established ethical frameworks for guiding human AI collaboration?
Yeah, absolutely. I think Pauline has made a really nice segue into, for me, what the top priority is, which is from a very applied healthcare perspective. We need to be thinking about the translation from theory to practice. A major question is, how can I use this framework to do better as I develop and deploy AI technologies into the healthcare space? And I think what we're seeing, particularly in healthcare AI, is that there's a lot that we're still learning, and a lot of the healthcare specific guidance is fairly high level, and that makes it open to interpretation. To give an example, I did a session with some machine learning engineers embedded within a healthcare company a while back, and we were talking about the principle of explainability, and we brought in maybe 10 or so different definitions of explainability that were shared with us by practicing clinical professionals. And there was a little bit of misalignment, but broadly it was in the same space. But really interestingly, those clinical definitions were very misaligned to the machine learning researchers' definitions. And so understanding, when we see in a framework that explainability is needed, what does that actually mean? How can I understand if I am developing, if my team is developing explainable AI that adheres to a particular framework? I think a second thing that feeds into relevance that Pauline touched on as well is kind of real clarity and consistency. And I think for us, this often manifests in the intersection of different frameworks that we need to be considering. So I think one great example in the US, we saw the draft AI Bill of Rights that came out, I think, earlier this year, later last year. And I think there were 5 major principles, and one of those, again, was explainability. But if you look at the FDA medical device regulation, they don't say we're not going to certify a medical device that contains a black box algorithm. So as manufacturers, how do we reconcile those different perspectives in a way that we can actually move forward and do better with our technologies? And for me, it's really a question of looking to continue to develop and refine and make clear what these frameworks actually mean for the day-to-day operations of producing healthcare AI.
Yeah, no, amazing. And just kind of opening the floor a little bit, is there any other thoughts around that side at all?
From my own experience, and it's similar, I suppose, to Sophie's, but in different sectors, is that one aspect of running machine learning, let's say, units or departments within those sectors, is that operators tend to get very enthusiastic about the potential problems that will solve, and tend to overrun ultimately what they're producing in terms of an output. And so there are certainly even broadly published standards that you can begin to arrive at that introduce that explainability as a standard for every single time you think you've got a model that provides you some kind of commercial advantage over your competitors. And so the introduction of that, especially in an engine-based system like you might get in banking or in telecoms, that everybody who operates in that space needs to become aware of their responsibilities around the outputs on a day-to-day and a sort of task-by-task basis, to begin to engender that let's call it societal responsibility in that type of system.
Yeah, no, amazing. No, thanks for that. Great. And
Harry, can I jump in real fast on that as well? I think it's really interesting how what Pauline and Sophie and Justin were saying, and I think what this kind of identifies is a tension that we're seeing between frameworks that attempt to be, if not universal, applicable across different cultures and different contexts, and yet at the same time a need for more specific or practical, as Sophie was talking about, practical guidance, consistency, like Pauline had mentioned as well. in order to operationalize these frameworks. And so this tension we've seen in a number of times as policymakers and the experts behind these frameworks try to strike that balance between a framework, again, that can be applicable in different countries, because AI, of course, is global. There are not AI tools that are used in just one country. And so we want to reflect values that people across the globe can endorse, but we also want to have a bit more detail and practicality, like Sophie and Justin were talking about. So I think it's a really interesting juxtaposition that we're seeing as these frameworks are disseminated.
Yeah. Oh, okay. I was sorry, Sophie. I was going to say, yeah, that's exactly what I was thinking as well. We keep talking about explainability and all these regulations, but currently it's all focused on generative AI, and we keep using the term AI, but what we're meaning is this new set of tools that have come out very recently. Whereas my background's actually in fintech, so financial technology. So black box and unexplainable algorithms are allowed to be used for some things, but they are not allowed to give a human output. That's actually one of so a credit decision, an overdraft decision cannot be made by an algorithm that cannot be backtracked in finance. It's kind of been like that for quite a while, just because it has to be explainable. But does that really matter in certain industries? I have this really random example of if you were creating a new board game, as long as it wasn't offending anyone, if an AI made it and it was completely made up and we've no idea how it was made up, but the rules are amazing, do we really care? Do we need it to be explainable? So actually regulating everything the same way doesn't make sense. Not all creative endeavors are the same, because sometimes we do need to backtrack to check that we haven't stolen someone's work and it's not infringing on copyrights. But yeah, I definitely agree with what Zachary was saying. We keep trying to regulate everything in exactly the same way, and that is not how this is going to work. It needs to be more specific. Sorry, Sophie.
No worries. Yeah, I just wanted to kind of build off of a point Zachary made, which I think was really interesting, about how we can achieve consistency, but bearing in mind that there are cultural differences globally. I was really honored to attend the Royal Society Summit on Neural Interfaces last week, and there was a discussion about a particular example where an AI-based technology was used to monitor concentration in a classroom in an East Asian country. And a lot of the people in the room who were from a Western background went, oh, that feels a bit wrong to us. And so there's a question of what are the cultural values that exist and how do they change? And how can we find a balance between respecting cultural differences in values and potentially in ethics, but still providing that clarity and consistency that allows people who want to build ethical technology to do so effectively.
Yeah, amazing. And I think just to kind of close off this section, I wanted to bring it back to Pauline. You mentioned the facial recognition side earlier on. So I wondered if you could kind of explain a little bit further this example where ethical frameworks have successfully guided collaborative efforts between human and AI systems, and what lessons can we learn from these cases, really?
Yes, certainly. I think it's a great case study example for that can be applied across sectors, because it stimulates emotive reactions, let's face it, depending on how this technology may be used. And we may be used to unlocking our phones, using the face, confirming or a transaction to authenticate, and we seem quite comfortable with that now. However, if it's used in different ways for surveillance, maybe in public places, for other reasons that are not your phone, to confirm that it's you, this is raising a huge debate around the ethics of that particular activity and the balance of power and the power gradient between the user and the subject. Now, the laws don't currently adequately cover this particular use case, and we're campaigning through our groups to urge the government to take a different approach to this. But in the meantime, what emerges is industry attempts, very good attempts at creating ethical frameworks. And that is driven by, for one, solving the problems, first and foremost, protecting people, and secondly, to support the economy and the growth of companies who have developed this technology. And I think that's the elephant in the living room frequently, these kind of debates, that, the commercial drive is there, and that's there because there is a problem to be solved. And that problem, in the most contentious form, is actually protecting people out in public from those who mean to do them harm, and also to find people who are in trouble from a vulnerability perspective, and to protect them and to keep them safe. So this is a very difficult area. So the frameworks that have been developed to manage this technology have come from industry for the users of the technology. And we have some good evidence, strong evidence now, that supports the case that without any kind of control, we've seen what can happen, and the technology is just thrown at organizations, law enforcement in particular, and they don't have any training. They are not subject to any sort of audit in terms of how accurate they are, how they're using it. And we've seen some awful cases where the human defers entirely to the machine, regardless of whether they can see the person in front of them is not the person they think it is, yet they'll still defer to the machine. So how do you stop that? And the frameworks that we've written, and I've written through the BSIA with the group there, and in the standards group now that's creating the ethical standard for the use of facial recognition software and video surveillance, we have embodied the OECD guidelines into the standard, and we have split that across every step in the value chain, from the developer right the way through to the system designer, to the deployer and the user of that software. And the really critical element in here is the human. Where is the human in the loop, and in what circumstances? And in what way are they empowered to make a decision, which otherwise could cause harm to a person? Imagine a retail environment. You wouldn't like to be stopped in your local store. In a case of mistaken identity, if they had somebody that looked like you on their list that was part of a criminal gang, that would be awful. So this standard puts checks and measures and balances in place. They're all written down. Industry is driven by to-do lists, by checklists, by operational policies, and fundamentally that the implementation of this software is actually on the board agenda, and the board and a named individual on that board or in the senior management team is held accountable for the safe use of that technology. Now that is working very effectively, in that we're now seeing where this kind of approach is implemented, we're seeing much better decisions emerging as a result of training, good policy, empowering the people, and a board accountability. So the directors are ultimately responsible, for the impacts that their business has on the communities.
Amazing. Thanks so much, Pauline. Justin, you have your hand up.
I did actually more directly in response to Pauline's observations there, and a question more is, Pauline, are you seeing any emerging trends around the type of role or the level of skill a user of the technologies must have rather than a developer? I'm thinking that if it's just a case of a mislabeling exercise, for example, when the AI gets it wrong, you mark it as wrong, then that ends up being a sort of fairly clerical piece of work that can ultimately be outsourced, offshored, whatever. And so in so doing, you kind of remove responsibility. You can offset responsibility to somebody else. So are you seeing any more detailed thinking around that should be integrated into higher skilled roles or people with greater skin in the game? How are you seeing that evolve?
Yes, and this is rooted in understanding what training is required in order to operate these systems effectively, and the deployer does play a significant part in that. And in fact, the EU AI Act is driving the developer to create very, very detailed instructions that guide the safe use of the technology. Where the deployer is concerned, there have been some really high-profile cases, not necessarily with facial recognition, where a trainee, somebody maybe who has completed their training, which was just one day, is on their own, in isolation, on the job, with the most powerful technology you could imagine in their hands, and they're not trained. how to interpret it. And that is totally unacceptable. That's as bad as having no human in the loop at all, if not worse. And they're almost certainly going to defer to the software. And if something goes wrong, they don't necessarily know what to do. So the evidence, what evidence is there? You know, the companies that deploy are getting involved in seeking guidance in terms of training. But these frameworks for training are still nascent. And there is nothing in law that requires that. EU AI Act does start to step into the detail here, which we're very supportive of. We'd like to see the same sort of approach being applied in other areas. We'd like to see licensing of the use of the technology. So, and that licensing is attached to a very rigorous framework of training, but also guidance about the levels of accountability in organizations, because a frontline operator may be trained how to click a button. Now, that isn't an appropriate level of skill in terms of interpreting a result from a very sophisticated system. And then the escalation process from that stage right the way through to understanding what harms can be inflicted on people. Well, that needs to start at the outset. So that assessment of impact on fundamental rights, again, I mentioned the EU AI Act again, so the fundamental rights impact assessment, which we hope will go into the final act, considers all these issues before the technology is deployed. But there's still some gaps in terms of creating consistent training frameworks, and that's going to sit on the developer, who at the moment is not guided by any regulation. And in the commercial world, you see the competitive position driving the standards, and it's what they say. So, you know, there's a lot to be done, but there's been much progress, and companies that are using the frameworks are training their people. They're very successful and effective in the deployment of their technology. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you.
Great, thanks. I noticed, I'm just in the interest of time as well, but I noticed Marcel and Zachary, you've got your hands up. So if you guys want to round off, we'll move on to the next topic after.
Yes, certainly. I think I just wanted to add to a final thing that Pauline was discussing, which is, and it's almost been implied in the conversation, but just how important it is to really take an interdisciplinary approach to building these frameworks. Something that I often do see is the question being asked isn't actually what the question that's being answered by those kind of ML tools. And when we think around from a developer perspective, often we're dealing in the realm of kind of confidence intervals and uncertainty, and we often do then see kind of that confidence interval turned into certain deterministic outcomes when taking it from a business perspective. So I think it's really important, and we've kind of touched on the importance of taking a use case driven approach first, but when taking that use case driven approach, really having a real breadth of people in the room who can then ensure that actually the questions being asked are the ones that are being answered by the tool, confidence is being spread in the correct way as well. So I'll just add that to that point.
Yeah, really good point. And Zachary, if you'd like to close us off.
Yeah, just shortly, thanks. Yeah, I just wanted to piggyback off of what Marcel and Pauline and Justin were saying, and first of all, we have because we have different kinds of tools being used in different contexts, then that the amount of responsibility that the user will carry will differ, of course, and so that's why it's interesting to think about what kind of responsibility we ought to be asking the user, the developer, the different parties along the line to hold. So at Trilateral, we've developed a shared responsibility model for our products because the context of use requires, so safeguarding organizations, helping vulnerable children, that requires a great deal of responsibility on the end user side. And Pauline mentioned the use case of facial recognition. That requires a great deal of responsibility on the end user side. And so this is why these ethical frameworks are so important to help us think about the risks of the tool, do risk assessments, think about those values, the danger to those values being violated, so that we can then think about the kinds of responsibilities that not only the developer holds, but that the end user or even the wider public would hold as well.
Yeah, No, amazing. No, really, really interesting. Great. No, thank you all. So next up, let's have a look at transparency and accountability, looking at ensuring fairness and avoiding bias. So Laura, to kick us off, why is transparency considered a fundamental ethical principle in AR decision making and interactions, and how does it impact trust and accountability?
Yeah, I think transparency is a really important thing. One of the things my research touches on is how we've kind of come into this way of having experts in public, and it's seen as like an us and them situation. And even from this discussion, we're talking about all these regulations being made, but they're being made by experts with no discussion of the public. So actually, it's never been researched that much whether the public cares about explainability, but we keep telling them they do. And my research touched on how we can think about educating people. And I think education is a big part around transparency and eliminating bias, is making sure everyone understands this to a certain level. And one of the things that came up time and time again is we keep telling people what they want to know. We keep telling people what education they should be having to be seen as AI literate or data literate or whatever the term is. And whenever you go and talk to people, they actually want to learn something very, very different. So part of my research was around literally sitting in a park asking people, did they want training in AI? And everyone said no to start with. And then when you dig into it a little bit more, you're like, okay, cool. Like, would you want to know this? Would you want to know that? And everyone had this really specific thing they wanted to. So like someone wanted to know, okay, all these systems like Alexa I have in my house, how does that actually work? Someone else wanted to know, how is this being used in council-led decisions in the area they live in? And actually, if we start doing that a little bit more in terms of like regulation and transparency, and actually going and asking people like, what does transparency mean? Maybe they can tell us, and then we can do that as a better framework rather than constantly telling people. And one of the really interesting things I found, kind of piggybacking on what Pauline said, was there is loads of education if you want to become an AI developer, or if you want to start building AI, or if you want a really basic level of what is AI knowledge. There is still, and my research was 4 years ago, no training in people who are going to be working alongside AI. So the people who are going to be using the systems. And again, we're telling them what they need to know. We're telling them they need to know this. We're telling them this is how this is going to work. This is how these systems work. This is how you avoid bias. But again, we should be going and talking to people who are working in call centers or working on video recognition systems and are being made to use this software now. And to me, that's how I think we actually get transparency and accountability, is training a whole different set of people, but actually co-designing the training with them.
Yeah, amazing. I think it's incredible how much AI we all use without even knowing it half the time. Marcel, I think that nicely leads that on to you. I believe you wanted to kind of discuss around generative AI in this context.
Yeah, so I think, and I believe it was a point that Laura made previously, when we think around generative AI compared to traditional AI. Right now, there's a large focus on Gen AI and all of this kind of emerging novel use cases, and all of the fact that we have to kind of ensure accountability in that area. But I think it's really interesting when we think around kind of from an impact perspective, how traditional AI still contains the kind of largest value capture opportunity. Of course, that may change through time. And with that in mind, we actually need to maybe take more of an approach, which I think has been bubbling out from this discussion from a use case perspective, and really talk about what are the use cases that are now augmented by both traditional AI and Gen AI versus the use cases that are now novel and therefore maybe require a slightly different approach. With that in mind, I think there's a kind of, we can look back through history again and look at some of the work that's been done. I look at, for example, neurosymbolic AI, which is kind of a combination of traditional rules and ensuring that there's actually gets logical safeguards around what is then a more ML-based system. And with that in mind, it then kind of helps naturally answer some of these accountability and transparency questions, because we will have actual formal safeguards as opposed to allowing it to exist in what is it kind of stochastic environment right now. So I think sometimes when we are trying to approach and resolve this question of transparency and accountability, sometimes the simpler answer, the more logical answer can work as well. We don't have to just exist in the most novel ML generative AI paradigm to try and resolve it as well.
Yeah, thanks, Marcel. No, thanks for that. Zachary, just leading on to you there. So what are your thoughts on transparency being an enabling principle?
Yeah, I think that really helps describe why it's a foundational ethical or responsible AI principle, and we can see this if we think about the other responsible AI principles besides transparency. We've got explainability, non-discrimination or fairness, accountability, enhanced decision making, privacy, and data protection. So if we think about those values, transparency can enable us to achieve those other values that altogether create a framework for responsible or ethical AI. So, if we want to be able to explain to end users how the algorithm works and why the output is significant for them, then being transparent about the data sets that were used, how the features were chosen for the particular model, etc., will enable that explanation. When we want to be able to identify and mitigate bias in a data set, then again, being transparent about where the data set came from, the data quality, missing data, etc., will help us be able to evaluate any bias or unfairness that might be embedded in the data set. Same for accountability, same for enhanced decision making. And so what we're really seeing is that a robust approach to transparency is extremely important to provide the conditions for achieving the other ethical AI or responsible AI principles that are usually outlined in the various frameworks that we were discussing a few minutes ago.
Yeah, amazing. And before leading on to Sophie, Rowena, I see you've got your hand up. So please fire away.
Thanks, Harry. Just wanted to quickly supplement what Zachary said. I think it's also about transparency in terms of objectives. Given the conversation that we've just been having now, I think it's very, very important that to add to the points that Zach made, that we enable transparency in terms of the objectives of the system, because it's then that we can see whether the system is achieving what it was designed to be or the objectives have changed. And I think that's just something we should keep sight of.
Yeah. Amazing. And just to kind of close this subject off, I just want to throw over to you, Sophie. I believe you want to discuss trust enables adoption in AI. So yeah, fire away, please.
Yeah, absolutely. Just before I do, I want to pick up on Rowena's point, because it's really interesting that within the medical device space, we have this level of validation and verification, and they're quite formal processes. And we validate and say, well, we wanted to predict, were you going to have a heart attack? Yes, we were able to do that. But then there's a separate level of, we wanted better health outcomes through predicting a heart attack. Have we achieved that? So I think really being transparent about what the objectives are and checking at multiple levels, are we achieving them, is so important. But Harry, just to come back to your original question, I think it's absolutely something that we see. Trust is fundamentally necessary in healthcare for adoption of any tool, and AI is absolutely no exception. And we see transparency as a really major way to drive this. Going back to Laura's point, there isn't a huge amount of research in terms of understanding what within transparency specifically clinical professionals are looking for when they think about commissioning an AI technology, or even a practicing clinician in terms of using a technology. And there's absolutely no sort of empirical research around, do we get better adoption of technologies that are more transparent, even setting aside for a moment the question of how we define transparency. But there is a degree of qualitative research that says that absolutely it does play a role. And I think the best way to summarize this is that with collaborations between two humans, particularly in the healthcare space, but I think just more broadly in life, we really do have this concept of get to the bottom of it. And so in the healthcare space, you'll have doctor number one who says, I think it's diagnosis A, and doctor number two says, I think it's diagnosis B. And the first question they'll have for each other is, okay, but why? And so being able to lift the lid and understand, what the thinking is that goes into a particular decision is really important. And you fundamentally can't do that if you have a black box algorithm. So while we do see clinical professionals being very interested in what is the data set, what is the parity in the data set, how was the technology developed and validated, and how is it performing in any formal clinical evaluation, there is a pull towards, I actually need to know why it's making any one decision at any one time, so that I can then build trust within that system and continue to use it practically.
Yeah, no, amazing. No, sounds really interesting and a big problem to work on in the future. So I just want to lean over to Pauline again. So what are some of the primary concerns and challenges related to ensuring accountability when AI systems are actively involved in collaborative endeavors with humans?
Yes, certainly. And I'd just like to make a comment regarding Sophie's point just then in terms of understanding the decisions. And I'll mention the EU AI Act again, which is going to require logging of decisions, which must be stored, and the user must be able to access those and understand them. So there's some work going on, but it's not in effect yet. So in terms of accountability, I think about this in terms of what a board might be doing, what decisions they might be making. And I just wanted to draw the distinction between board decision making and other ethical decision making. They are different. And the difference is fundamentally down to the commercial interests of the organisation, fundamentally when money's involved. So looking at accountability and how boards might consider what their actions might be, they definitely respond to regulation. And because they understand that there's something laid out, it's very clear, sometimes very clearly stated, I must say. And these may be considered to be measurable and manageable risks for a board, and they will mitigate through governance and compliance measures, whatever they may be. And when the ethical debate starts in a boardroom scenario, it can get a little bit blurry, unfortunately, because although ethics are embodied in the law, although not explicitly stated as such, they're considered perhaps optional when the regulatory position comes first and foremost, and then the commercial position of the organisation follows that. And then should we be doing this is somewhere in that list, but certainly not at the top. We'd like to see it at the top. And some boards are better than others, but the approach to ethical decisions can be driven simply by the values of the shareholders and the directors. That is a risky business in terms of a buyer looking at what are we actually buying into here? Do they have to go and meet with those people? And in reality, some of them do. If it's not actually operationalized and embodied in some kind of statement that they follow through. We felt that it was so important that the accountability sits at board level that we actually wrote a governance framework. My company wrote it, and that governance framework is a non-technical guide. We appreciate that boards they're catching up, and we're seeing something highly technical and able directors emerging now, and that's because there is a push towards education and awareness, and Gen AI has definitely improved that, but it is just one dimension of AI, and it's to the consumer, it's a more gimmicky dimension, although it can be used in very effective ways. So this guide is written as if someone were talking to a director to say, you're the board, you're accountable, you set the rules, and you must ensure that no harms are actually done as a result of using the AI that you're using. Many boards don't know they're using AI, and they don't know what it's doing, and that's partly why we wrote another framework, which is our AI risk intelligence system. But the ethical framework, it's very simple. It just lays out a number of principles that ensure the basics in terms of the questions that need to be asked. And in fact, we have gone a step further, and through my voluntary work with the Institute of Directors, I took that to their policy team and suggested they may wish to advise directors 20,000 members, that's quite a large community of statutory directors. So they're looking to the Companies Act in terms of what their duties and responsibilities are. And the IOD said, yeah, we'll do it. Come and join our expert advisory group for science, innovation, technology. The group inputted and they improved it. And that's now been published, and that's freely available to anyone actually that wishes to download it from the IOD website. And we've gifted that to the IOD so they can use it. But this is a very important start point. And one thing I would hasten to add is that we're seeing in our dialogue, we see quite a huge gulf between the understanding of directors and the technical teams that do the implementation. It's a language barrier. And we'd like to see those groups come closer together, because you hear the developer, is the developer an individual or is the developer a company? And you need to understand the distinction there, because the developer, there's a lot on their shoulders if it's a coder sitting in a team. And if they don't have a governance framework that's set by their organization, how do they make decisions about ethics in the development of their product? So these areas need to come together. So we're doing our bit, in terms of donating our framework, and that it's under a Creative Commons license, so anybody could use that if they wish to.
In terms of the developer, I suppose it depends very much on whether you have them in-house or you've outsourced that relationship, and what the incentives are in terms of, I guess, the alignment of that relationship with the producer.
Yes, indeed.
Yeah, great. I was going to lead on to Sophie, but Marcel, just as you got your hand up.
Yeah, I just wanted to make a brief point on something you mentioned, Pauline, in terms of within the boardroom, how actually that initial focus really is on the kind of compliance and regulatory framework, and then the ethical conversation becomes slightly blurrier at times. And I think within AI, specifically at this time, one of the really interesting facts is that it's almost in a unique place where the ethical stance almost is an investment in long-term regulation in a lot of cases as well, particularly as we're in a stage where regulation hasn't quite caught up and it's still being put into place. A lot of these are companies that are really taking this like proactive ethical stance, i.e. saying we're going to use data that is fair, will actually lend themselves to not having to retrain, not having to reinvest in the models or the companies that they're partnering with as well. So it's something that we definitely try to encourage our orgs to work with in terms of being proactive now will put you 5 or even 10 years ahead in a lot of cases as well.
That's a brilliant point. Can I quickly jump in and respond to that and just say what happens if companies just proceed without any frameworks? So, of course, it is a rich field for innovation when there's no regulation, okay? But what can happen if ethics aren't at the heart of the decision-making? There's a company called Clearview AI who did social media scraping. They grabbed faces and names from social media to build their database and made a product that anyone could point at someone else and identify them. Now, in itself, there was nothing in law saying they couldn't do that. It wasn't clear. And they proceeded on that basis to make a commercial product. And it was pretty successful. But then there were some really significant issues in terms of misidentification, problems with privacy, and the regulators took a very long time to figure out under which clauses, what laws are they actually broken. And as a result of them pioneering and going ahead with their innovation, actually it created clarity around what could or couldn't be done. And now they've now put the policy, they put governance in place, and they vet who uses their software, and they're in control, and they understand the supply chain, and they're taking an approach which has been, they may not have survived that process. They did actually. They received very large fines, but now they've put in place a number of measures which prevent that happening again. But the harm was created, unfortunately. So how many examples do we need, before we decide, actually, let's start with ethics?
Yeah, no, amazing. No, thanks for that, Pauline. Thanks for that, Marcel. Sophie, if you can kind of round it off, love to hear your thoughts here.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one thing that's really interesting that Marcel picked up on is that regulatory frameworks are evolving, and we see this particularly around AI and particularly in healthcare. And so there are often these really competing priorities around commercial success, regulatory requirements, ethical considerations, and they all kind of have their place in the pecking order now. But I think it's a really interesting perspective to think about, are the ethics the regulation of the future? And kind of looking into the future and thinking, well, okay, I have clarity on what the regulations are, and I can adhere to that, and that's fine, and we'll put the product on the market, and we can start making money and sustain ourselves, and hopefully having good through our technology. But if we're ignoring the ethics at the cost of doing that, then in 2 years' time, we're no longer going to adhere to the regulations. So I think that's a really fascinating point, that it's absolutely something that we see coming from startup, scale-up land, where you always have fewer resources than you need. There's always something that's going to give, and it does tend to be ethics. And there's, that real tension between the ethical integrity and the commercial success of the company. And I think that manifests in two ways. One is that we build in a scrappier way than we should do. We find that many healthcare AI startups need to build a product before their runway runs out. Otherwise, they're not going to help anyone. And so they might prioritize, we're going to build a product and we'll come back and we'll do the ethical product later. And that might mean getting access to a cheaper, more quickly accessible data set that actually doesn't represent underrepresented groups in society particularly well. But I think we also do tend to see this in poor use of AI. So one example, there was quite a lot in the news earlier this year of payers in the US, people who ultimately decide, are we going to pay for a person's healthcare? We're using algorithms ultimately to deny care. And so as manufacturers of algorithms, you have this real question of, well, we can keep going for a bit if we sell to the payers and, yes, it's an evil, but it allows us to go ahead and develop this technology and use it for good. And so I think we really do feel these tensions, and there's no black and white way to approach them. But as we start to see these ethical frameworks built more concretely into regulation, I think that's going to give a lot of clarity to manufacturers about where should we really be going, and kind of reduce the space of kind of that strategic interpretation of these frameworks.
That's a really, really interesting point there, and I think it nicely leads us on to kind of the next section. So there's a lot of ongoing conversations, and all of you will have an idea of how to perceive strategy and best practices for identifying and mitigating biases in collaborative processes. But Justin, could you kick us off with a practical example that you have for the application of bias mitigation?
Yeah, so I guess if I can dovetail into the point that Sophie made there's this constant ethical commercial trade-off that we're all dealing with, and the sectors where I've worked tend to be naturally highly generative in terms of data, whether it's banking where you've got your payments, your transactions, it's telecoms where ultimately you can track where anybody is on their phone using your mobile cell tower, is then I have the minutiae of that data available to me. Should I go and use that? And ultimately, there are some, I guess, regulated against segregation of duties when it comes to the management of that information within those sectors, right? So if we take banking, for example, where individual transactions are necessary in certain circumstances, for example, financial crime. But if you are then there to sell new products to your customer or provide new service to customers or try and break into a new sector, then from a regulatory standpoint, you're simply not allowed to target individuals at that level. Okay, and so when we look at the practical implementation of those types of regulations at an aggregate level, we need to begin to point out initially what kind of pre-processing is taking place on that data, so that we start with data sets that don't identify the individual in some way. Additionally, we tend to be working in jurisdictions where there is in fact differentiated regulation around the identification of the individual, and then whether or not it's actually even possible to target, say, in some ways in the United States, they're essentially illegal in Germany, for instance, right? And so we look to identify initially what type of pre-processing is taking place and explain that pre-processing as well, okay? In other words, some minutiae around what information is available in order to make suppositions about subsequent behavior of groups of individuals that are identified in that information, right? You then perhaps run it through a model where you've got some kind of prediction outcome that you're looking for, but ultimately you also then want to explain the output of that model in such a way that is understandable to somebody that doesn't necessarily understand what the model is trying to achieve in the first place. Typically, a model card approach is a useful let's call it vehicle in this space, but also we tend to have independent testing as an approach to try to cover that.
Yeah, no, amazing. No, thanks so much for that, Justin. And nice, I think that leads to Marcel. I hope that you could discuss bias mitigation techniques kind of at the training data application stages.
Yeah, definitely. And I think it completely is in parallel to what you mentioned, Justin, in terms of the first starting with pre-processing and then going on to modeling. Something that we really think about is trying to identify exactly what are the kind of discrete areas where bias can enter. So of course you've got data, You then got modeling. You then actually there's this like new area of fine tuning as well, which is quite interesting. And there's approaches where we've seen a model will initially, particularly with some large language models, they'll begin with kind of spitting out what was equivalent to nonsense, and then via the fine-tuning process, you can then align it to what you believe is the right kind of instruction and response in return to that. And that process of fine-tuning, it really, again, introducing bias, what does it mean to have a correct answer versus not a correct answer? And then finally, looking at the kind of final application and ensuring, as we've discussed throughout this panel, ensuring the questions being answered by the system are actually correct as well. I think there's also a second layer. So of course, those are the kind of discrete layers there, but there's also the industry layer and something that we've alluded to, which is language specific ML systems and how bias can be entertained from there as well. A large amount of kind of large language models in this current state are English specific. So as we begin to think around different languages and the effect that that's going to have on data generation across the internet, again, there's bias to be introduced there as well. So from a mitigation perspective, it really is around trying to have as much variety from a data collection perspective, from a training perspective, trying to have, again, variety of perspective and understanding that you can't potentially mitigate bias, but you can give a good representative distribution of the population that you're trying to engage with in each domain, and then finally looking at downstream education as well. So I hope that kind of explains some of the areas.
Yeah, no, definitely, Marcel. No, thanks so much for that. And Laura, I think Laura and Sophie are going to kind of tag team this, but Laura, I'd love for you to kind of talk about the hiring side of this.
Yeah, so another aspect of actually my PhD research was talking to individuals and companies about what skills are needed to work in. I think the list was data science, machine learning, AI, and robotics. One of the reasons using all of those is because the public don't see any difference between them, really, at the end of the day. Experts love to argue about what the very finite difference between these things are, but the public really doesn't care. And one of the things I kept saying was, we talk about the skills that we need, and we go on and on about how we need people that do more than just coding, right? They need to be ethical. They need to be able to work with people. They need to have a social science background. They need to do all these really wonderful things. But then job descriptions are written and interviews are done, and the only thing people care about is whether or not they can code. And regardless of how much companies say they don't care, they really do. Even when they are the ones spearheading, I want this business savvy person to come in and use this to like make us loads of money, they still hire for coding. They still also hire from really typical coding backgrounds. Like they might say they like boot camps and people can come in from boot camps, but that is not what their hiring suggests. Their hiring suggests they like people who have been good at math and programming since they were children. And they've come up and done the really stereotypical, gone to university, worked for like certain types of companies, and now they want to hire them. My big problem with that is, especially when it comes to like ethics, is one, people aren't necessarily being taught this at university. They're not being taught to think in a certain way, but also we're hiring exactly the same person over and over again. And maybe one of the people might have some characteristic about themselves that makes them think slightly differently. But if we want this technology to be ethical and work for everyone in the whole world, then we need to make sure we're hiring people from lots of different backgrounds, lots of different ways of thinking. And it's a really difficult one because I think Sophie, you mentioned about how companies are going for profit, right? That's what they have to do. They have to build a product. So the best way to do that is to hire the best developer, the person who's going to build the thing fastest for you. So it's almost in my head like we need to get the government to be putting incentives for people to be hiring in a certain way. It maybe slows down development a little bit, but the end product is probably going to be better because it's been thought about from such a different point of view. I find that really interesting. I do a lot of talking about this. Justin.
Oh, only when you finished, Laura, no problem. Well, as a direct question to yourself, do you see apprentice schemes in the UK, for example, as not being adequate at this stage? They need to be more wide-ranging?
I think apprentice schemes are really, really interesting. I think there is a particular one in, I think it's data science or data analytics, where Deloitte, for example, are doing a lot of work in that space and they're retraining a lot of staff that they have. I I don't think apprenticeship schemes are necessarily fit for purpose, because the type of people we maybe want to be moving into these roles don't want to spend 18 months to 2 years studying alongside their jobs, because that is how it works at the minute. So if you have caring responsibilities, if you just don't want to spend all your evenings studying, and if you don't potentially want to be tied into that one employer for, I think doing an apprenticeship scheme, I can't say that word, sometimes ties you in for quite a long amount of time. However, you could do on the job training for people who want to learn coding and want to learn these technologies, because let's be perfectly honest, I'm a technologist. Everyone can learn to be a technologist if given the correct conditions, right? It's not one of these magic skills that people can't do. However, the softer skills, the human skills, you can't actually teach that quite as easily. You can teach coding and math to people. So I kind of think hire for the other bits of it and then put the time in, but it's extremely difficult for startups to do this. I do understand that. So maybe the bigger companies should be the ones who have to bear the brunt of this a little bit for a while. Like, they've had their success and I pay it back a little bit.
Right. And Sophie, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I just really want to echo pretty much everything you said, Laura. And I think it's absolutely something, I think it's a skill you can't teach, but I think you can't give somebody a new perspective. And it's really about knowing what you don't know, which we don't fundamentally. There are a number of instances where I've been the only woman on a team of all men, and they're developing a technology, and you kind of come in and go, guys, this isn't going to work for half the population. I'm really sorry, we need to rethink it. And so having people who are able to bring that diverse perspective and represent those different voices in the room is really important. There's a fantastic book called Technically Wrong. I'm not sure if I'm allowed to promote something, but it's all about different algorithms that have been developed, and they all come from Silicon Valley, where everyone is a 25-year-old, very privileged white man who's hired his friends. And there are just so many instances of people not thinking about actually how can we think about our edge cases or stress cases, people who aren't like us, who will want to use our technology. And if we don't think effectively about the development and think comprehensively about the development, the technology fundamentally will not work for them. And there's a lot of research that shows the best way to do that is just to have those people in the room rather than trying to sort of artificially introduce it later as an afterthought.
Yeah. No, really, really important point there, Sophie. No, thanks for that. And just to round off this subject, just being aware of time, Pauline, want to discuss developer and deployer side of things. Please fire away.
Yes, certainly, and I'll try and keep it brief. But one point I wanted to make, actually, to reflect all comments on this particular area. So it sounds like there's the rush to get product to market. We know about this. Companies have a runway, and they have to start delivering sales, or the runway runs out. Now, that could be seen as the root cause of some of these issues, which lean towards hiring developers that can do it quickly, as opposed to those who consider where did the data come from. And I will answer the point, but what I'm referring to is patient capital, which UK isn't known for. In reality, if you look at Google's DeepMind, a bit more patience there, and the UK would own that. Instead, Google owns it. It's great. They employ lots of very, very talented British people, and they're doing great work. But the patient capital situation is a problem in the UK, based on my knowledge and research, and allowing more time for consideration towards ethics, allowing the developer to learn about the questions they need to be asking about the source of the data and whether it's representative of the demographic, rather than going online and seeing what they can hack from some open source library. That's really not okay, but that happens because they're under pressure. In terms of the deployer, equally, they need to know what questions to ask, and they don't always know what to ask because the black box scenario is rife, and without any sort of regulation and uniformity in the way AIs are described by way of functionality. It's one of the reasons why we developed our system, which is an AI risk intelligence system. It queries, it's the deployer asking, what does this AI do? And can you search on characteristics of people? Now, if you can, this is biometric driven, they're probably categorized. So that's okay, that's not allowed under the EU AI Act. And also what's missing. So in order to determine what's missing, the data has to be categorized. So this is a contradiction, all right? So to buy demographically diverse data, you have to know it's demographically diverse. How do you know? Because it's been tested, it's been categorized, but that categorization needs to be removed from that data, and that doesn't always happen. So does the deployer know to ask those questions? And then looking at how is this problem going to be solved? I'll mention the EU AI Act again, sorry, it's a bit repetitive, but they have really considered the use of biometric data and introduced new categories in terms of defining it, sensitive data, biometric-based data, and what you can do with it, identify, categorize, profile, infer. And these are all new concepts, which I believe are really going to go a long way to help the deployer ask the right questions, but also help the developer really think about the data they're using. So rather than producing a shiny result that pleases the investors, they're actually producing a sustainable product that isn't going to get them into trouble later, because they will get fined if they do this in Europe. So those are my thoughts on it, and fantastic contributions. Delighted to be closing off that point, and back to you.
Yeah, no, thank you all. And I'm sure you've all got loads of questions for each other, but just in the interesting time, don't take too much of your day up. The last discussion point, and it is an ongoing conversation, and it is a big point, but it's the future implications and recommendations. So I thought it'd be good to kick off with Zachary. So what potential societal impacts do you foresee as human AI collaboration becomes more prevalent, and how can these impacts be positive and negative?
Yeah, it's of course a question that we're all asking ourselves and each other, and it's no secret that AI tools are everywhere, in our pockets, in terms of our cell phones, doctors' offices, the classroom, planes, trains, not to mention in terms of police using AI tools, or at the border for border control. And so, I think there's no question that these tools will become even more widespread, and it's hard to know precisely how they're going to impact society. Again, that points out how important these ethical frameworks are. All the points that my colleagues have been making in terms of how important it is to reflect on these tools, and how important ethics is when we are developing these tools. But I think I think our listeners will probably be familiar with Kranzberg's first law of technology, since it's been repeated so often, which is technology is neither good nor bad, nor is it neutral. And so we can't guess or assume that a certain tool will be one of those. And one of the reasons for that is that the technology that we create, it's technology created by people for people. And so these tools really reflect our values, right? They don't come ready-made with values. They reflect our values. And this can give us a lot of freedom, right? Because it's our choice, but it comes with a lot of responsibility as well once we realize that it's really up to us which values we want to implement into the tools that we're making. And I'll just give you one quick example. Microsoft released a chatbot named Tay back in 2016. Probably our listeners are familiar with this. And in less than a day, individuals turned this chatbot into a racist and anti-Semitic chatbot, right? Through use with it and misuse. A few years later, a development company produced a chatbot for young women in rural Pakistan to provide them with reproductive health information that they could not access, either owing to geographical or cultural hindrances, and providing them this information to help them stay healthy and to lead a life that they want to. So again, we can see that not that Microsoft was malicious in what it did with its chatbot, but when there's a lack of reflection on misuse, or a lack of reflection on the ethical values we want a tool to reflect, versus a situation where we pay very close attention to the ethical values we want to implement into a tool, like in the latter example, we see quite a difference. And I think that's an important lesson for developers and end users moving forward.
Amazing. No, thanks so much for that, Zachary. Really good point. Laura, I believe you want to talk about that. We're a bit of a crossroads.
Yes, sorry, if I can find my mute button. Yeah, to me at the minute, we keep talking about, and actually this really leads on from what you were saying, Zachary, quite well, like technology isn't necessarily good or bad, AI isn't necessarily good or bad. Actually, where we're at the minute is how we decide how it's going to be used in society. So to me, we're at this really important crossroads where we decide that AI is going to do all the fun, creative stuff and write movies and write books and like make beautiful artwork, if it can even make beautiful artwork, but that's a different discussion. Or we decide that we're going to use it as a tool, the same way we've used like robotics in factories to free up people to potentially move into more management roles and not do dangerous jobs. I would love it if AI could take over some of my really boring, repetitive tasks in a day and do them all for me, and I could spend all day doing really interesting things. And what I think is actually going to determine this is how a lot of the copyright laws play out at the minute. So we've got the writers' strike in America where they are asking for safeguards against AI taking their jobs or them being proofreaders for AI content, which I think is completely valid. I also am not sure if you saw that a TikToker made a deep fake of a song that was Drake and The Weeknd and has now submitted it to the Grammys for Grammy nominations. And they haven't given a response yet, but I think that's going to be really interesting because what happens? Are they going to say fine? Are they going to say no? They're going to have to put some rule in place about whether this is allowed. And we see this happening all the time. So Amazon is now making self-published writers say if any of their content was generated by AI, not assisted by AI. So we are moving towards valuing creativity and valuing humans being creative, which I think is good and a good way to use these tools. But then we are at a crossroads where that might not happen. We might decide none of these copyright rules apply anymore and AI can do whatever it wants to. So to me, that's kind of where we're at, and that's going to determine how we use these tools. For good or bad is too binary, but for helping humans or maybe replacing the bits that humans love. And to me, that's very important at the minute.
Yeah, no, amazing. Really good point, Laura. And Rowena, I think you want to talk about changes to power relations. Please fire away.
Thanks, Harry. I think when we talk about impacts, right, I think something that based on our research that we've always seen is we need to talk about how AI potentially either empowers. So it's a great tool that can empower us in many different ways, right? And it's also something that can cause asymmetries. So I think looking at it in terms of who shapes the system and who is kind of affected by it, I think this is something we need to put more thought into, because I think it is changing relations. I mean, it's changing relations at all different levels. And also thinking more widely in terms of how it is changing the balance of power. For example, whether this is between countries, so we can see this very publicly. Also, for example, the power relations between who is governing and the governed. So I think it's not just the legal thing, but the more wider societal context. It's furthermore also changed the relations, I think, and the dynamics between developers and users, I think. So, the end users, and how does this play out, right? So taking the example of use of AI tools, for example, in case of workplace or employment settings, again, it could shift the balance in favor of employers, or it could shift the balance in favor of employees. I mean, it could go either way, but there will definitely be changes, right? So maybe it's a devaluation in one case, maybe it's an improvement in another case. So I think depending on whether we use an ethical approach or a responsible approach, I'd like to keep the discussion on power relations kind of focused in the whole impact debates.
Yeah, no, amazing. I think, Marcel, you can kind of follow on with that, looking at kind of an emerging trend that you've seen.
Yeah, definitely. And I just wanted to call out a big point that's been made throughout, which is how really this whole kind of concept is people driven and is us at the center and making decisions, which is going to drive the impact that AI has. And I often do see this kind of slight I guess, humanizing of AI systems, which almost abstract responsibility from the decisions we're presently making. So I do want to just stress that actually it's our decisions that are going to impact that. In terms of a particular emerging trend, I think we're currently in this mass consumption world where it's like, can we consume as much as possible and kind of hit every dopamine receptor possible? But that's now being married with this mass production world where, particularly with the advent of open source tools and open source AI models, we now more easily than ever can create language, can create video, can create images. And I think to Laura's point, it will then be very interesting to see how does that go. Will we see centralized bodies making key decisions that impact how we decide kind of the validity of a creative tool, or will we see actually maybe a move to even a completely open source world where we don't really even look to the Grammys or look to some of those centralized bodies anymore? I think the biggest thing that will be really difficult to do, but it'll be interesting to see how it plays out, will be the kind of nature of truth and the ownership of our kind of likeness. In that sense, more than ever with deepfakes and with any form of content being created, it is more difficult to know whether something actually is true or not. So can we create tools that make it easier to recognize whether something is AI generated versus not? And then in terms of ownership of likeness, it then is what parts of us do we own? What parts of us do we begin to sell? Will we end up almost selling our likeliness in ways that already are happening, or even in novel ways to organizations to then have kind of generative tools built on top of that as well. So I think it'll be, as has been mentioned, we're at a crossroads, and it'll be very interesting to see the decisions we make that will kind of influence where we're going from there.
Yeah, great. And just before I jump over to Pauline, looking at the time, are we all okay to add an extra 10, 15 minutes onto the session, or does anyone need to hop off? All okay? Okay. Pauline, please, yeah, if you want to discuss the potential impact on the workforce now and future generations, that'd be great.
I wondered whether Sophie wanted to make her point, actually, because you had your hand up. So perhaps if we go to you before my point.
Gosh. Absolutely. I didn't realize I did. Apologies. I'm not excellent at Google Meets, but yeah, just happy to kind of contribute in terms of the potential societal impacts briefly from a healthcare perspective. There's huge opportunity to close down the gap between demand and supply that we see in healthcare at the moment. And obviously, the more we can do that, the more that gives an opportunity to reduce health inequities. But really, it's the negative effects and the risks that we have started to see materialize, which are the really concerning bits. So there was an algorithm that was actively deployed in the US and used on, I think, hundreds of thousands of individuals in hospitals that aimed to identify high-risk patients. The label that was used in that algorithm wasn't brilliantly aligned. And so you ultimately had to be much sicker as a person of color to be referred into the specialist care space than a white person. And we see, there was an article about a sort of quote unquote sexist kidney injury detection algorithm that was trained on a data set that was 94% male, and surprise, surprise, didn't work fantastically in women. So I think we do see a real opportunity or a real risk within healthcare to exacerbate inequities that already exist in society. And then, of course, it's the job of the developers to put into place ethical development practices to avoid that. Sorry, Pauline, back to you.
Yeah, of course. That's a really good point. In fact, isn't most pharma tested on men? And I think the first safety test dummy for a car, first female, was created in Sweden this year. So just to round off that point, it's important. But AI may correct these biases because the AI is doing it now. So something's got to be done about it. My point really relates to the impact on the workforce and concerns about future generations. And this is based on what I'm seeing and hearing in terms of the AI selling proposition, which is often rooted in efficiency and productivity. And those terms are associated with more profit, which generally means fewer people. And it could mean lower skilled people that cost less money or no people at all. And I do feel it's very important that for the benefit of the future generations and the current generations, that there needs to be a really deep thinking process in terms of the impact and risk of de-skilling jobs. Because AI is not going to be successful if nobody's got a job. So just reflecting on that point, it may well be an efficient tool. It may reduce training time. Let's take the technician, technical support. They've got to read thousands of pages of technical documentation. So we know Gen AI could interpret that for them. And that technician may just become a prompt engineer, which in itself is a skill, and people, can get training for that. But in reality, where is the real learning in that? And when does the career building start in terms of building layers of knowledge and experience? So I think there's a real concern there that we all, have a stake in terms of ourselves and the future generations. And I would like to see more focus on augmenting humans. And that's not the same as giving someone a button to press. And especially those who are less able for some reason. And that, I believe, will contribute to ensuring equity rather than de-skilling. And the AI then enables the development of a skill because a human that may not have been able to do it previously, we look at assistive technology, that will interpret the scene and read out what's in front of somebody who has a sight issue. That's just one example, but these are really deep issues, and without driving the boards to make ethical decisions. So it's a whole community, an ecosystem of decision makers. Everyone has a stake and a responsibility in this, and we need to protect jobs now, because there are mass job losses happening in tech support and customer service, and we need to think about the future generations and what knowledge and skills and career paths are actually available to them.
Amazing. Thanks, Pauline. And yeah, quickly, over to you, Laura.
Yeah, I was just going to say, and I don't mean this to take away from what you said at all, but I find it really interesting that you've called out like prompt engineering as potentially a job that's not as good or not as skilled. And I think back quite significantly to when social media was on the rise, and like even a couple of years ago, social media manager and social media person was seen as this really not respected job. And it was like, oh, these millennials who are playing around with their new technology and they're making little videos and stuff. And that was how it's talked about. It's not a very well respected job, and people make quite a lot of money doing it. And not that I think everyone should be a prompt engineer, but it is actually really highly skilled. To be excellent at writing prompts and getting exactly what you want and need out of these programs is actually very highly skilled and very transferable. So if people did spend the time understanding how to do this to potentially help in an office job or something like that, that is actually something that can be transferred across. So I don't think everyone should be a prompt engineer, but I don't think everyone's quite dismissive of this as a skill, and I don't know if I 100% agree with that. I can see value in it. I can see it being really useful for people who currently are out of work, like learning this skill, and then when they go to apply for an admin job, that could be the thing that sets them apart, is while they're getting hired to do something else, them having these skills actually potentially something a small business might really value. But that's kind of what I'm seeing. I'm kind of pushing this at the minute, that I think it's a really useful skill to learn, because it at least shows you're keeping up to date with new technology.
Yeah, no, great, no, really, really valuable on the flip side. So thanks, Laura. Great, and yeah, just kind of keeping things moving. Zachary, as we look to the future, what recommendations can we offer to policymakers to establish regulations and guidelines that promote ethical and human AI collaboration?
Yeah, I think there are several things recommendations that I would make to policymakers, but the two that I'll mention here are really a summary of I think a lot of things we've been saying already in the last hour and a half. The first one is, and there's been growing awareness of this amongst policymakers, which is that technology is really socio-technology, right? I made the comment earlier, these are tools made by people for people. Several of my colleagues here have talked about the human element, and that needs to remain in focus, and as well as the awareness that the interests that motivate the pursuit, the development, the sale of a particular tool are social interests, right? And so if Pauline was just talking about efficiency, and so if a company values efficiency, that comes from their values and from their social situation. At the same time, tools that are then created end up influencing our interaction, our values, how we reflect on the use of those tools. And so this socio-tech situation is one where both the social and the technological are interrelated and influence each other. And so that understanding has to remain at the forefront of any sort of policymaking. And as I said, fortunately, policies, regulations that we've been seeing over the last several years have been more and more responsive to that sort of perspective. So that's a really positive development. The second thing I would say is specifically looking at the UK. In the UK, in comparison to Europe, where we have the EU AI Act coming out, in the UK we have a standards approach that's being pursued, and this remains to be seen how successful this is. But I think it's justifiable in certain ways. I'm also very much looking forward to the EU AI Act as well. But these are two different approaches that we're seeing. And for the UK to be successful in their approach, providing these standards, they have to really focus on providing concrete thresholds for achieving the values that they espouse. And so, for example, if there were to be regulation or a standard around doing a bias audit, and it will be sectoral as well, so a bias audit in, say, the health sector, then the standard ought to provide concrete information about how much bias is admissible, how to conduct this bias audit, what are the outputs that companies ought to be striving for. Because if not, we'll start to have a sort of Wild West of AI assurance companies providing these services. Well, we can do a bias audit, but the output of those audits might be quite different. And so as we move forward, providing that sort of detail, that consistency, and the thresholds that would be acceptable to society, and especially UK society through its standards, will be very helpful to try to achieve these responsible AI principles.
Yeah, amazing. No, thanks, Zachary. And Rowena, I believe you can add to this, looking at the considerations of vulnerable groups and the power dynamics.
Absolutely, and I think what we can focus on, and we can improve. I think there's a lot of engagement going on already in terms of addressing the needs of vulnerable groups, and even the EU AI Act, to throw it in there, does recognize vulnerabilities and these groups. So I think particularly looking at it in terms of children, I think migrants and refugees and people with disabilities. These are just some examples, but I think each system ought to recognize who it might affect. And I think we can make impact assessments better. I think there's always much more you can do in terms of addressing vulnerable stakeholder needs. So I would like for policymakers to incentivize the addressing of these, because it's something that sometimes gets pushed to the side. We try to do this, but we can move even further, considering that each AI system, each AI tool and service has different impacts in different contexts, in different domains. I think it's also important to use this frame of vulnerability because it can guide our risk and impact mitigation efforts, right? So when we do it, we also learn from it for the future. So I think it helps us then to protect our human and societal well-being. It also kind of goes to that core thing of protecting human rights, which is, I think, something that is very important and we should not lose sight of.
Yeah, amazing. No, thanks so much, Rowena. No, that's great. And Sophie, just to add on to that, I wanted to discuss the importance of providing clarity, I believe.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that the content of the frameworks and the policies that we're receiving is so important. To Rowena's point, are we considering underrepresented groups? And that's probably not. But in addition to that, once we get to the place where we've solidified the content, really supporting developers to understand how they can translate those regulations into practice, as we touched on earlier, taking the theoretical and making it very practical, as well as helping developers to understand how the different frameworks and regulations intersect with each other to have a clear path forward. I think one of the really interesting things that's potentially a little bit unique to healthcare is not to overregulate. because it does feel as if we're starting to get to the point where not adopting AI in healthcare is becoming unethical. There's a great example, a company based out of Oxford called Oxford Heartbeat. They use an AI tool to basically work out how big does a stent need to be for a medical procedure. And the performance of their algorithm, I think in partnership with a human collaborator, is really incredible. And particularly if you compare it to sort of manual human assessment of that particular procedure alone. I'm not sure if it's on the market right now for that particular technology, but if we did have a regulation blocking that because of that kind of clinical conservatism that we do see, then we have a real question of, we know we could be saving lives, but we're not allowing ourselves to do it just yet. So I think really about, not over-regulating is something that's quite important in healthcare at the moment.
Yeah, no, definitely. No, thanks so much for that, Sophie. And Marcel, over to you quickly, the dual importance of open source and closed source. Please tell me.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I just wanted to mention that point Sophie you made. I think that's really interesting in terms of actually the lack of adoption being unethical. And there's always this tension between momentum and perfection. At what point do we actually just kind of need momentum and iterative approaches? So yeah, thank you for raising that. In terms of open source and closed source, I think it's, again, interesting when we think around a lot of attention goes towards a lot of the closed source and large organizations, for example, OpenAI, Meta, Google, and DeepMind, and actually how a large portion of AI development will come from the open source community, and therefore the kind of increased requirements to actually provide clarity over when you're operating in this open source environment, what can be done and what can't be done from a regulatory perspective, and also how actually an open source environment really does enable kind of competition to ensure that we don't end up with a consolidation of all of the kind of AI development within a small number of groups. In terms of that approach, I think we can definitely draw parallels when we think around the regulation around typical open source deterministic software. And there will be things that we can draw from that in terms of perhaps how actually it's the responsibility of those applying the open source software to conform to regulation as opposed to those who are building the open source software. But then in the flip side, there will be elements that will need to be different due to the stochastic nature of outputs that exist within these kind of ML models as well. So I think really engaging with the open source community and players like Hugging Face, actually, in fact, Meta have open sourced a lot of models as well, Alufa, etc., and ensuring they're in the room as well to ensure that they kind of are contributing to any form of regulation, and as well is super important.
Yeah, no, fantastic, Marcel. Justin, just quickly, we'll finish off with Pauline after Justin. Then we've got one last subject to go through.
Yeah, sorry, 30 seconds on that, Marcel. I'm completely in agreement in there. I think that mature businesses that are generating a lot of data can decide to have some kind of posture, if you like, to the open source community. They can themselves contribute, and companies like Google or Facebook are modern day great examples of serious research that's available for broad consumption, right? And then it's up to the open source community then what they do with that.
Yeah, no, great. No, really good point actually there, Justin. Pauline, yes, if you could close this off, that'd be great.
Okay, so looking at the UK government's regulation proposals, they've put forward principles-based approach, which is those principles we've discussed at length here today, and those are based on the OECD's ethical guidelines. But for these to, let's say, to be taken as a de facto way of doing things, shall we say, the statutory footing of those principles needs some support, in that the regulators need to have some kind of teeth and autonomy in the way they apply those principles and how they regulate their particular sectors with those principles at the heart. And the current position seems to be like a holding pattern. In reality, there's a lot of really, really good work going on in the Digital Regulators Cooperation Forum and so on at this level. But the government needs to make a decision about this. And of course, the EU AI Act, which has been mentioned multiple times, not just by me, is rooted in the protection of the fundamental rights, health and safety of individuals. that is at the heart of it, and front and center of the whole approach. And that in itself, I do feel, will bake in the human collaboration, human AI collaboration, because it will be the law. And that will be a requirement for high-risk AIs. But all AIs are encouraged to be developed in this way. And for organizations who are developing or buying AI, just even if some of that touches on high risk, they will have to look at this approach, and why not adopt it for all AI? So see some really positive things coming out of here. But I would like to see regulation to the extent that where the harms are totally unacceptable, that there is some means of, there's a right to redress, that a route to causation. And this is where the EU AI Act, the point of it is that you can trace through from the user, the deployer, right the way through to the developer, the provider of that software, and the person that's been harmed can actually take action with another framework within Europe, which assumes fault on the basis that the act wasn't implemented by that company. I personally find it difficult to disagree with that approach in reality, because it's based on human rights, fundamental rights. So it's a strong point. But AI is a wonderful technology, but it can also cause a great deal of harm, and we've already seen some of those harms. So how can we, as a society, allow that to prevail without actually recognizing and then taking action to prevent those harms from occurring?
Yeah, amazing. No, thanks so much for that, Pauline, and thank you all on that side. Aware we've already overstretched the time, but as long as you guys are all okay, our last point of discussion, and it goes over to Justin, but from an industry perspective, what steps can stakeholders take to ensure that their AI collaborations align with ethical principles, and what role should research play in shaping the future of AI ethics?
Sure. So given we're overrunning, I'll just add a couple of very quick points here. From the practical implementation side of the industry, I feel there's, at the project level, probably an adjustment you can begin to make in terms of the way projects are structured and executed. In other words, allocation of budget and time to making sure that ethical principles are most definitely baked into every project that you have that relates to machine learning, artificial intelligence moving forward. And then the other thing I would say is, at the individual developer level, is begin to raise awareness about how you can have some standards around the communication of output from models, so that from a model comparison point of view, you can begin to have a sort of an apples to apples approach, and then begin to determine whether or not biases are showing up in your models over time. In terms of the research, well, I'd sort of argue that's very much dependent on the size of organization. Ultimately, if you're a small business that is somewhat reliant on the open source for the development of your product, then perhaps the first thing you can do is give back to that open source community ultimately, in terms of them perhaps helping you with a feature that was required, and that then being baked into your product over time. That's perhaps a virtuous circle that's kind of a valid avenue. As you're a larger organization, does research and innovation hold a core part of your corporate budget on an annualized basis that you can state, I've got a percentage of my, let's say, P&L that is dedicated to the improvement of our products and services over time?
Amazing. Thanks for that, Justin. Thank you for keeping it as concise as possible. I know it's a huge topic itself. Rowena, over to you, talking about kind of the self-reflection side being critical.
Thanks, Harry. So I think the point I wanted to make is, I think we need, when we are developing AI products and services, I think to have safe spaces, and in fact, not just safe spaces, but I think comfortable spaces for self-reflection, right? I think about, because I don't see ethics as something that is a tick box exercise, but it's a learning and doing process. And this is something that adds immense value for various reasons, because further down the line, you don't want to then have to either have a product that doesn't work or isn't accepted by society. So I think this reflection is important at various points. So it's about an agile reflection, if I'm allowed to call it that. So also seeing ethics as something that you don't stop just because you might have reflected on it at the design stage, but you've got to reflect on it at the next steps in the process as well. And this is very valuable. In terms of the contribution that research can make, I think we have a really good example in Trilateral, because I think it was the way that our research work also then kind of embedded into our ethical AI products and services. It is quite challenging. So we work with, in our other research projects also, we work with technologists, tech developers, and I think being able to come together with a common purpose, to have a common goal, as in, we're going to look into this, we're going to find the issues for you, we're going to talk together, we're going to find that common language. I think it's something that kind of gives us a lot of, maybe I'm using the wrong word, but a certain sense of common purpose and joy in terms of taking something to market that has actually considered and been able to, in some small way, make use of research. So it's about research with impact towards, an ethical goal. So I think that's something I would like to recommend, is making sure we reflect. Sometimes there's not enough time, but I think carving out that time is important to reflect.
Yeah, definitely. I love the use of agile within that as well, Rowena. Thanks for that. And yeah, just to kind of close off, we've still got Marcel, Pauline, and Sophie to have comments. So Marcel, if you could fire away.
Yeah, certainly. And I similarly love the phrase of kind of agile reflection and taking that a bit of time towards actually researching to see that kind of ethical cause. I think what that brings to mind to me is I'd also love to see more kind of even startups going after some of the frameworks that we described from an ethical impact perspective, and really trying to build tools, whether the tools themselves are embedded with ethical AI or tools to enable other organizations to kind of implement ethical AI practices as well, and to really increase, as we've described, the auditability, transparency, and what that will really enable, what that will really require is perhaps, on some sense, maybe we can go by the typical kind of profit-making route, but others will require kind of government support and government loans and those sorts of equipment to enable these organizations to build things that we know will have negative externalities into the future as well.
Yeah, amazing. And I think nicely, Pauline, you can lean into that and talk about stakeholders and adaptation into UK government AI principles.
Yes, well, my recommendation would be that stakeholders can adopt the UK governance AI principles now. There's nothing to stop them from doing that. No one said don't do it. The only bit missing from that is the statutory footing for those principles. But one concern I have is that buyers are really confused about what questions to ask. And they need some kind of start point in terms of, well, what do we need to know about this? And those principles are a very good start point. Of course, those practices will be embedded in law in Europe. So companies that aren't already preparing for the EU AI Act, they will be doing very soon. And this is driving a whole dynamic and tension between the deployer and the developer, who developed without, some of them have, but many have developed without any kind of uniformity in the principles and the way they developed. And now they're having to answer questions from the user. So tell me about this system. And those questions based around those principles are not unreasonable. Other emerging legislation, such as in Canada, have embedded those principles. But we talked about standards. Zach in particular mentioned standards, and there are a number of sectoral and horizontal standards emerging, which again align with these principles, because everyone's gone to the OECD, so who's done a lot of research into this, and is there a start point? And one standard that I mentioned frequently is the ISO IEC 42001. Which is the AI management standard. It's for deployers and for developers. And if you haven't looked at that already, it's going to be released very, very soon. And it's starting to emerge as a leading standard, possibly the gold standard globally for AI management, that walks through risk, impact, and so on. And there are other standards. There's a risk management standard, which is 23894. And from a domain perspective, if you're in security and facial recognition, and you're not sure whether you can use it in a shop or not, look to the emergence of BS 9347, which is the ethical standard for the use of facial recognition software in surveillance. That will be emerging, towards the end of the year. So there are lots of there are government-driven initiatives, but also through the standards bodies. Have a look at the AI Standards Hub, which is a public resource which gives you access to all the AI standards that are emerging, and start jumping on board and getting involved, because work that is done now is not going to be. This isn't going away. So any investment into ethical structures baked into the development process is money well spent. And the time, obviously, we talked about time, Rowena, time is of the essence. Allow the time for it, because ultimately it's moving towards something that's going to happen. There is going to be some regulation, and buyers are getting educated. They will know what questions to ask, and those questions are going to be based on principles: what harm, but also how effective, what's the impact, what jobs will be created, what jobs will be lost. And this dialogue's already happening. So I would recommend that everyone watching this is really gives that some thought and starts doing it. Just start today.
Yeah, no, really valuable. Thanks, Pauline. I believe, Sophie, you've got a point that you can close us off with, and then I think we'll wrap up after that so you guys can get to your important work.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Harry. So just briefly, very briefly, taking us back to the original question of what can stakeholders do to really ensure that these collaborations do align with ethical principles. I think we've already spoken about making sure that ethics are really embedded within the company, top to bottom, rather than having an ethicist come in and say, team, I need to redirect you. Having a shared voice rather than one voice in the room, I think goes a long way. And there's a lot of research that supports that. Another approach that I think can be incredibly powerful if you can get it right is really aligning incentives in a very clever way. So Laura, you made a fantastic point earlier of a lot of these companies are focused on profitability, but if you can somehow manage to swing the company focusing on some metric like lives impacted, and that wraps up both profitability, every time we impact a life we make a profit, but also ethical principles. Every time we impact a life we make sure it's treating all lives equally. And I think once you can get alignment around this is actually what we're driving towards, and it really closely ties together the more ethical elements and the less ethical elements like profitability, then that's a really fantastic tool for the whole company to drive forward. And it's thoughtless. You're being ethical because even if there's a person who just wants to drive towards profit, every time they take a step to do that, they're also driving towards ethics.
That's amazing point, and no, thanks for that. I'm so sure you all could have so many questions and different points of views, but I think in the interest of this nearly being a 2-hour session, I'll wrap it up there. But I just want to thank you all so much, and for the non-expert on the panel, by quite a stretch, I'm incredibly inspired and encouraged by all of what you guys are doing in this discussion itself. I mean, it's opened my eyes, and I was expecting it, let alone what our listeners and viewers might see as well. So I just want to say thank you all again, and if anyone else does have a sentence statement to say, please feel free to do so. If not, we'll close off there.
Thank you very much, guys. Nice to meet you all.
Thanks, Harry. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, guys. Cheers. Bye-bye.